Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, settle in, and prepare for another journey into the past. Tonight, we're stepping through the imposing gates of a medieval castle, but not as a visiting dignitary or noble guest. We're exploring what daily life was actually like for those who lived within those massive stone walls, and I promise you, it was nothing like the romantic fairy tales suggest. We're venturing into European castles roughly between the 11th and 15th centuries, during the height of the medieval period. This isn't the Hollywood version with spacious chambers, roaring fireplaces that actually warm entire rooms, and elegant ladies in pristine gowns gliding through spotless corridors. This is the real experience: the cold, the damp, the cramped quarters, and the daily struggles that made castle life far less glamorous than you might imagine. Before we begin our tour, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. And if there's another historical setting you'd like to explore, let me know. Your suggestions help shape these journeys through time. Now, let's approach those towering stone walls and discover what really awaited inside. The first thing you need to understand about medieval castles is that they weren't built for comfort. They were military fortifications first, residences second. Every architectural decision prioritized defense over livability, which meant that the people living inside had to adapt to conditions that would make modern building inspectors weep. Picture yourself approaching a typical castle. Massive stone walls rise before you, perhaps 30 or 40 feet high, built from huge blocks of limestone or granite that took years to quarry and transport. These walls are 10 to 15 feet thick at the base, thick enough that defenders could fight off sieges lasting months. Impressive from the outside, certainly. But remember, you're going to be living on the other side of those walls. The outer walls created what we might call a microclimate problem. Stone is an excellent material for defense, but terrible for thermal comfort. It absorbs cold like a sponge absorbs water. During winter, the stone walls would become so cold that frost formed on the interior surfaces. You could scrape ice off the inside of your bedroom wall in the morning. During summer, the walls retained the previous night's chill well into the afternoon, making the interior perpetually cooler than outside, which sounds pleasant until you remember that medieval people had no way to generate significant heat. Stone also has another problematic property: it weeps. Moisture from the ground wicks up through the stone, and humidity from the air condenses on the cold surfaces. This means that castle walls were perpetually damp. Touch them, and your hand came away wet. Clothes stored against walls developed mildew. The smell of damp stone permeated everything. In particularly wet climates or seasons, you could see water actually running down interior walls. This constant dampness contributed to respiratory ailments that plagued castle dwellers. As you pass through the main gate, a massive wooden door reinforced with iron bands and secured with heavy bars, you enter what's called the bailey or courtyard. This open area was the heart of castle activity during the day. It might house workshops, stables, storage buildings, a chapel, and living quarters for servants and soldiers. Think of it as a small fortified village contained within walls. But it was also cramped and chaotic. A typical castle might house anywhere from 50 to several hundred people, depending on the lord's wealth and the castle's strategic importance. All these people, plus horses, livestock, dogs, chickens, and other animals, shared this relatively small enclosed space. The smell was extraordinary, a combination of animal waste, cooking fires, human sweat, forge smoke, and the general accumulated odors of people living in close quarters without modern sanitation. The forge deserves special mention because every castle needed a blacksmith. The constant ringing of hammer on anvil echoed off the stone walls at all hours, creating a noise that was both essential and maddening. The forge produced intense heat in summer and welcome warmth in winter, but it also generated smoke, sparks, and the acrid smell of hot metal that drifted across the bailey. Sparks from the forge were a constant fire hazard, which is why blacksmiths often worked in separate buildings with stone walls and limited combustible materials nearby. The ground in the bailey was typically hard-packed earth or cobblestone, perpetually muddy in wet weather and dusty and dry. Drainage was rudimentary at best, usually just slight grading that encouraged water to flow toward drainage holes in the walls. After rain, the courtyard became a quagmire of ankle-deep mud mixed with animal waste and refuse. Crossing from one building to another meant getting your shoes and the hem of your clothing thoroughly soiled. In winter, this mud froze into uneven, treacherous ruts that made walking hazardous. People fell regularly, sometimes breaking bones on the hard, frozen ground. The stables housed the castle's horses, essential for transportation, warfare, and prestige. A lord's status was partly measured by the number and quality of horses he maintained. But horses produced prodigious amounts of waste that stable hands struggled to keep up with. The smell from the stables was intense, especially in hot weather, and flies bred there in numbers that would horrify modern people. These flies spread throughout the castle, landing on food, crawling on faces, and generally making life miserable during warm months. Now let's focus on the main residential building, the keep, or donjon. This massive stone tower was typically the oldest and strongest part of the castle, designed as a last refuge if outer defenses failed. It was also where the lord's family and most important household members lived. Medieval keeps were usually square or rectangular towers, 4 to 6 stories tall, with walls even thicker than the outer castle walls, sometimes 20 feet thick at ground level. This thickness was necessary to support the weight of multiple stories and to provide defense, but it also meant that interior spaces were smaller than the external dimensions suggested. A keep that measured 60 feet on each side externally might have rooms only 20 feet square inside once you accounted for wall thickness. Climbing these structures meant navigating narrow, winding stone staircases built into the thickness of the walls. These spiral stairs were intentionally designed to favor right-handed defenders fighting downward. They spiraled clockwise going up, which meant attackers coming up had their sword arms against the central pillar, while defenders above had free swing. Another reminder that military concerns trumped convenience. These staircases were dark, steep, and treacherous. Each stone step was worn smooth by countless feet, making them slippery. The steps weren't uniform height. Medieval stonemasons didn't have our standards for consistency, so you couldn't develop a rhythm. Some steps were 8 inches high, others 12, forcing you to pay constant attention. The passages were narrow enough that 2 people had difficulty passing each other. There were no handrails. The only light came from occasional narrow window slits or whatever torch or candle you carried. People regularly fell on these stairs, and injuries were common enough that most castles had multiple people who limped from old stairway accidents. Carrying anything up or down these stairs was particularly challenging. Imagine hauling buckets of water, baskets of food, bundles of firewood, chests of clothes, or chamber pots of waste up and down these dark, narrow, uneven spirals multiple times daily. Servants developed incredible balance and leg strength from this constant climb. The wealthy rarely carried anything themselves, but that meant their lives depended on servants willing to risk broken necks on dark staircases. Let's enter the Great Hall, the castle's main public room and, in many ways, its social heart. This was typically the largest interior space in the castle, perhaps 40 feet wide and 60 to 80 feet long, with a ceiling height of 20 to 30 feet. It sounds impressively spacious, and it was by medieval standards. But remember that this single room served multiple functions for dozens or even hundreds of people. The Great Hall was dining room, courtroom, entertainment venue, reception area, and sleeping quarters all in one. During the day, it might host formal meals, legal proceedings, audiences with the Lord, training for pages and squires, business negotiations, and general socializing. At night, servants and lesser household members would spread pallets or sleeping mats on the floor and bed down wherever they could find space. Privacy was non-existent. Personal space was measured in inches. The hall's most prominent feature was usually a large fireplace, often magnificent enough to walk. Some castle fireplaces were 12 feet wide and tall enough for a man to stand upright inside. They burned whole logs, sometimes entire tree trunks, that took several men to maneuver into position. But here's where Hollywood gets it wrong. One fireplace, no matter how large, cannot effectively heat a massive stone room with a 30-foot ceiling. Most of the heat rose straight up and escaped through smoke holes in the roof or inefficient early chimneys. The area immediately around the fire might be warm, even uncomfortably hot. But 10 feet away, you'd still see your breath in winter. The physics are simple, but cruel. Hot air rises. A roaring fire in a massive fireplace creates a powerful updraft that pulls cold air in from every crack and crevice. This creates drafts at floor level that constantly blow cold air across anyone sitting away from the immediate hearth area. People clustered as close to the fire as they could, sometimes scorching their fronts while their backs froze. The Lord's position at the high table, slightly elevated and backed against a wall hung with tapestries, was carefully chosen to minimize exposure to drafts while remaining visible to all. The cold was relentless and inescapable. Stone walls, stone floors, high ceilings, and inadequate heating meant that castle residents dressed in layers year-round. Even in summer, the interior stayed cool enough that you'd want a cloak in the evening. In winter, people wore every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped themselves in furs and woolen blankets, and still shivered. Chilblains, painful inflammation of fingers and toes from exposure to cold, were universal. Everyone had them. They were simply part of life. Think of it as living inside a giant stone refrigerator with a small campfire in the middle. The floor of the Great Hall was typically stone, occasionally wood on upper stories, covered with rushes or straw that served as both insulation and absorber of spills. These floor coverings were scattered in layers several inches thick and needed frequent replacement. They became soaked with spilled food, drink, dog urine, and less mentionable substances. The smell of decomposing rushes was a constant presence, masked somewhat by herbs and flowers that were scattered among them, lavender, mint, rosemary, which helped but didn't eliminate the underlying odor. The practice of changing rushes varied by household and season. A fastidious lady might have them changed weekly. A less careful household might leave them for months. By the time old rushes were removed, the bottom layers were a putrid, composted mass that released spectacular smells when disturbed. Dogs loved to root through rushes, hunting for dropped food, which distributed the decomposing matter more evenly and added dog fur to the mixture. Windows in the great hall and throughout the castle were small, narrow, and few. This wasn't aesthetic preference, but defensive necessity. Large windows created weak points in walls that enemies could exploit. The narrow slits that passed for windows, called arrow loops, were designed for archers to shoot through, not for illumination or ventilation. These openings were typically only a few inches wide on the interior. Flaring to perhaps 18 inches on the exterior, they admitted minimal light and created focused drafts that were like having small wind tunnels aimed into your living space. Some wealthier castles had slightly larger windows in upper-story chambers where defense was less critical. These might be fitted with glass, an enormous luxury, but medieval glass was thick, uneven, full of bubbles and imperfections, and came in small panes held together with lead. It distorted everything seen through it and blocked more light than modern glass. Most windows had wooden shutters that could be closed against weather, but this meant choosing between cold drafts or darkness. These tiny windows meant that castle interiors were perpetually dim, even during bright daylight. On cloudy days or in winter, when daylight hours were short, the interior was downright gloomy. People relied heavily on candles, torches, and oil lamps, none of which provided much light. A large candle might illuminate a circle 6 feet in diameter with weak, flickering light. Reading by candlelight strained the eyes. Fine needlework was nearly impossible. Most activities requiring good light had to be done outdoors or near windows during the few bright hours available. The constant insufficient illumination contributed to eye strain and probably explains why so many medieval people needed spectacles once they became available in the 13th century. It also meant that colors appeared muted. The brilliant hues of medieval clothing and tapestries that we see in museums today would have appeared shadowy and dull in actual medieval lighting conditions. That bright red gown looked burgundy in the great hall. The vivid blue tapestry appeared gray-blue in typical lighting. The gloom also affected mood and health. Seasonal affective disorder, depression caused by insufficient light, must have been common, though it wasn't recognized as a condition. The long, dark winters, when people spent most of their time in dimly lit interiors, would have had psychological effects that medieval people accepted as normal winter melancholy. Tapestries deserve special mention because they were one of the few creature comforts in castle life. These massive woven wall hangings were incredibly expensive. A large tapestry depicting a hunting scene or biblical story could cost as much as a prosperous village produced in a year. But they served crucial practical functions beyond decoration. Hung a few inches from the cold stone walls, tapestries created an insulating air gap that made rooms slightly less frigid. The air trapped between tapestry and wall stayed warmer than the stone, and the fabric itself provided a barrier against the damp. They also reduced echoes in the massive stone chambers. Sound in an unfurnished stone room is harsh and reverberant, but tapestries absorbed, and they provided some visual warmth, even if they didn't provide much actual heat. Looking at scenes of gardens, forests, or elegant courtly life offered psychological comfort during long winter months. But tapestries also harbored insects, moths, bedbugs, fleas that nested in the fabric. They absorbed moisture from the damp walls and occasionally grew mold, especially in their bottom portions. The backs of tapestries, hidden against the walls, could be disgusting. They required regular maintenance, beating to remove dust and insects, airing in sunlight to kill pests and dry moisture, and occasional repairs where moths had eaten holes. This was all difficult work because tapestries were heavy. A large one might weigh 100 pounds or more, and the delicate weaving could be damaged by rough handling. Now let's discuss the private chambers, the bedrooms where the Lord's family and important guests slept. These were typically located on upper floors of the keep, as far from ground level as possible for security. They were smaller and somewhat warmer than the great hall simply because they had lower ceilings and smaller volumes to heat. A typical Lord's chamber might be 15 by 20 feet, modest by modern standards, but these were among the more spacious private rooms in the castle. But warmer is relative. These chambers were still cold by any modern standard. Many had their own fireplaces, but the same problems applied. Inadequate heating for the space, most heat escaping up the chimney, perpetual drafts from poorly sealed windows and doors. A fire in a bedroom fireplace made the area immediately around it bearable, but did little for the rest of the room. The corners farthest from the fire remained freezing. People slept in beds with heavy curtains around them, not for privacy, remember. Servants and attendants often slept in the same room, but for warmth. These bed hangings, made of heavy wool or thick linen, created a smaller space that could be heated by body warmth, essentially turning the bed into a tent within the cold room. When the curtains were closed, your breath and body heat warmed the enclosed space to something approaching comfortable. But this also meant sleeping in a stuffy, stale air environment with minimal ventilation. Medieval castle beds were impressive pieces of furniture, massive wooden frames ornately carved if the owner could afford it, with rope or leather strap support system, topped with mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool depending on the owner's wealth. The ropes required regular tightening as they stretched with use and humidity. This is where the expression "sleep tight" originated, literally meaning to tighten the ropes of your bed. A bed with loose ropes sagged in the middle, creating an uncomfortable hammock effect. The mattresses were piled high with blankets, furs, and coverlets, again not for luxury, but for survival. You needed that many layers to stay warm enough to sleep. A typical noble's bed might have a straw mattress at the base for structure, a feather mattress on top for comfort, linen sheets if the family could afford them, several wool blankets, fur coverlets, and perhaps a decorative silk or velvet covering on top. The whole assemblage was heavy enough that making the bed was serious work. But even the Lord's bed came with problems. The mattresses required regular restuffing as the materials compressed and decomposed. Straw broke down and became powder. Feathers clumped together and broke. The fabric coverings, stressed by the weight of occupants, developed tiers that needed mending, and despite all efforts, the beds hosted impressive populations of fleas, bedbugs, and other insects. Bedbugs were particularly troublesome. These flat, oval insects hid in cracks in the bed frame during the day and emerged at night to feed on sleeping humans. Their bites were itchy and uncomfortable, and heavy infestations could actually cause anemia, especially in children. Medieval people tried various remedies. Smoke in the bed with sulfur, sprinkling it with wormwood or other bitter herbs, even disassembling and scrubbing the frame with vinegar. Nothing worked completely. You simply learned to live with being bitten during the night. Fleas were equally prevalent. They lived in the rushes on floors, in clothing, in bedding, and on the many dogs and cats that inhabited castles. Everyone had fleas. Scratching was so common that it wasn't considered rude. Special flea-catching devices existed. Small ivory or wooden tubes with sticky interiors that trapped fleas attracted to body heat. Combing for fleas and lice was a regular evening activity, often performed by servants for nobles or by family members for each other. It was a form of grooming and social bonding, though a necessary rather than pleasant one. The bed curtains, while providing warmth, also trapped air that became stale and stuffy. Morning breath was probably spectacular, especially since nighttime oral hygiene consisted of nothing at most. The curtains also blocked what little light there was, meaning that the interior of the bed was pitch black. Getting up in the night to use the chamber pot meant fumbling in total darkness, hoping not to trip or knock anything over. Many people simply didn't get up, using the chamber pot while remaining in bed, or, in less fastidious households, simply waiting until morning. Bedrooms also contained storage chests, massive wooden boxes reinforced with iron bands and secured with locks. These were essential furniture because castles had no closets. Everything the family owned, clothes, linens, valuable objects, important documents, money, was stored in chests. A wealthy family might have a dozen or more chests in various rooms, each for different categories of belongings. The chests themselves were pieces of significant furniture, often elaborately carved, or because they were constantly visible. These chests served multiple purposes. Besides storage, they functioned as seating. Their flat tops made convenient benches. They could be used as tables. They served as room dividers. In some cases, a chest's lid could be opened and the interior used as a desk or work surface. But their main purpose was security. Expensive items needed to be locked away, and a heavy wooden chest with iron bands and a good lock was the medieval equivalent of a safe. The challenge was organization. When all your clothing is packed in chests, finding a specific garment means unpacking and repacking. Medieval people developed systems. Seasonal clothing stored in one chest, formal wear in another, everyday garments in a third. But accessing anything required effort. Servants whose job included managing the wardrobe spent significant time packing and unpacking chests as their lord's needs changed. Let's talk about sanitation, because this is where castle life becomes particularly challenging by modern standards. The castle's latrine, called a garderobe, which ironically translates as guard robe, was typically built into the thickness of an exterior wall. It consisted of a small stone chamber, perhaps 4 feet square, with a wooden seat featuring a hole that opened directly to the outside, usually dropping waist down the castle walls into a moat, cesspit, or just onto the ground below. Picture this. To relieve yourself, you walked through cold corridors, sometimes outdoors across the bailey if your chamber was in a separate building, to a small stone closet. The stone was always cold. You sat on a wooden seat that was also cold, in a drafty, unheated space that was barely larger than a phone booth. Cold wind blew up through the hole beneath you, chilling your most sensitive areas. The only light came from whatever candle or lamp you brought, and you didn't want to waste expensive lighting in the latrine, so you often did your business in near total darkness. In winter, this experience was memorably unpleasant. The wooden seat was so cold it stuck to bare skin. Your breath was visible, your teeth chattered. Getting your cold, stiffened fingers to manage your clothing in the dark was its own challenge. Summer brought different problems. The smell from below, especially if the garderobe emptied into a moat or cesspit, wafted upward. Flies bred in the waist and crawled up through the hole. The small stone room became hot and airless, making the smell worse, and you still sat on a wooden seat that, while not cold, was now warm and slightly sticky from previous users and crawling with flies. Some people opted for chamber pots in their rooms instead. These ceramic vessels, ranging from simple crocks to decorated pieces depending on status, sat under the bed or in a corner behind a screen. Using them avoided the cold nighttime trek to the garderobe, but created other problems. Chamber pots needed emptying, a task that fell to unfortunate servants called grooms of the stool or chamber attendants. They carried the pots, often multiple times daily, through the castle to be emptied into the garderobe or cesspit. The risk of spilling was ever present, especially on those narrow spiral staircases. The smell from a full chamber pot was intense, and it permeated the room where it sat. The garderobe earned its name, guard robe, because people stored clothes in these chambers. The ammonia from the urine-soaked walls was thought to repel moths and fleas, which it probably did to some extent. So your finest garments hung in what was essentially an open-air toilet, absorbing the smells. Medieval people had different standards for odor than we do, and they believed the ammonia actually preserved and cleaned the fabric. Bathing in a castle was an elaborate and infrequent affair. A full bath required heating massive quantities of water, perhaps 50 gallons for a reasonable bath. This meant filling large cauldrons or kettles, hanging them over fires, waiting hours for the water to heat, and then having servants haul the hot water in buckets up those narrow spiral staircases to wherever the wooden bathing tub had been set up, usually in a bedroom. The tub itself was often just a large wooden barrel cut in half, big enough to sit in with your knees bent. This process took several servants' hours of work and was expensive in terms of fuel and labor. Wood had to be gathered or purchased. The servants had to be paid or at least fed. The sheer logistics meant that full baths were special occasions, not regular occurrences. A noble might bathe a few times a year, perhaps before major religious holidays, before a wedding, or if particularly dirty from travel. The very wealthy might bathe monthly, which was considered almost obsessive cleanliness by medieval standards. The bath water itself was often shared, used by multiple family members in descending order of status. The lord bathed first in clean hot water, then perhaps his wife in water that was now cooler and slightly murky. Then children in increasingly tepid and dirty water. By the time servants bathed, if they were allowed to use the bath water at all, it was cold, gray, and thoroughly unpleasant. But waste not, want not. Heating all that water was too expensive to use it just Daily once. Hygiene consisted of washing hands and face in cold water from a basin, maybe cleaning teeth with a chewed twig or cloth, and hoping your underclothes absorbed the worst of the sweat and body oils. Servants brought basins of water and towels to the Lord's chamber in the morning, but the water was cold, unless someone had heated it specifically. Washing in cold water in a cold room in winter was an exercise in speed and determination. You splashed your face and hands as quickly as possible and dried off, shivering. Changing underclothes was considered a form of cleaning. The theory was that the linen shirt or shift that had direct contact with skin absorbed body dirt and oils. When you put on a fresh underlayer, you were effectively cleaning yourself. Outer garments, expensive tunics, gowns, robes, might never be washed, only brushed, beaten to remove dust, and aired out occasionally. The fabric was too valuable, and washing risked shrinkage, fading, or damage. Some garments were passed down through generations, probably accumulating impressive levels of built-in odor. The result was that castle residents at all social levels had distinctive personal aromas. Wealth might buy you better perfumes and essences to mask the smell, rosewater, lavender oil, frankincense, but everyone stank by modern standards. In the confined spaces of a castle, with dozens of people living in close quarters, the accumulated body odor must have been impressive, especially after a feast when everyone was crowded into the great hall and had been dancing or exerting themselves. Medieval people had a complex relationship with smell. Strong scents were thought to ward off disease. The miasma theory held that bad smells caused illness, so good smells should prevent it. This led to the use of perfumes, aromatic herbs, and incense not just for pleasure, but for health. But it also meant that people became accustomed to strong odors of all kinds. What would nauseate a modern person? The smell of a full chamber pot, unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps. Medieval people simply accepted as normal background smell. Speaking of feasts, let's discuss food and dining in the castle. The Great Hall hosted meals multiple times daily, though only dinner, the midday meal, and supper, the evening meal, were substantial. Breakfast, if eaten at all, was a simple affair of bread and beer taken informally. But dinner and supper were formal, structured events that reinforced social hierarchy and provided one of the main entertainments of castle life. The lord and his family sat at the high table on a raised platform, called a dais, at one end of the hall. This position was literal and symbolic. They were elevated above everyone else, looking down on the assembled household. The dais kept them away from the worst drafts at floor level, gave them the best view of entertainment, and ensured everyone could see them. Dining was a performance of status as much as a meal. The high table was covered with a white linen cloth, itself a luxury, as tablecloths needed frequent washing and linen was expensive. The lord and his immediate family had individual plates, cups, and utensils. The plates might be pewter or even silver for the very wealthy, marking another status distinction. They were served first and received the best portions of every dish. Below the high table, other household members sat at long trestle tables arranged down the length of the hall. These tables were literally boards laid across trestles, portable wooden frames so they could be removed to clear the hall for other uses. This also meant they weren't perfectly stable. The boards could shift if someone leaned too heavily. Drinks spilled, plates slid. You learned to eat carefully. Seating at these lower tables was rigidly hierarchical. How close you sat to the high table indicated your status in the household. The most important knights, advisors, and guests sat nearest the dais. Lesser knights and upper servants sat farther down. The lowest servants sat at the far end, sometimes literally outside the main hall in an adjoining room. Everyone knew their place, and seating disputes could become serious matters of honor. Seating was on long benches without backs, simple wooden planks supported on legs. They were uncomfortable for long meals, which encouraged eating efficiently and then yielding your spot to the next group of diners. At large castles with many residents, meals were served in shifts, with different groups eating at different times. This practical arrangement also reinforced hierarchy. You ate not only in a specific place, but at a specific time, depending on your rank. Food arrived from the kitchen, which was often a separate building in the bailey because of fire danger. Every castle lived in fear of fire, and kitchens with their massive hearths, open flames, and hot grease were particularly hazardous. Keeping the kitchen separate meant that if it burned, it wouldn't take the whole castle with it. But this arrangement meant food was frequently lukewarm by the time it reached diners, especially those at lower tables who were served after the high table. In winter, meals might be nearly cold. Servants carried food in processions from kitchen to hall, a spectacle in itself. Large roasts on platters, tureens of soup or pottage, baskets of bread, pitchers of wine and ale, all were carried by lines of servants moving between buildings, across the bailey, through corridors, and into the hall. On rainy or snowy days, this meant food arrived not only cold but sometimes wet. On windy days, dust and debris found their way onto plates. The servants did their best, but conditions were challenging. The menu varied dramatically by status. The high table might enjoy roasted meats, beef, pork, venison, wild boar, swan, peacock, or other game. They had fish on fast days, fresh pike, salmon, or lamprey from rivers, or expensive salted cod and herring brought from the coast. They had white bread made from refined wheat flour, a luxury that marked them as wealthy. They had imported spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, that cost enormous sums. They had wines from France, Germany, or even Italy, transported at great expense. And they had elaborate dishes like meat pies, blancmange, and frumenty that required skilled cooks and expensive ingredients. Lower tables got coarser food, dark bread made from rye, barley, or mixed grains, the kind that was dense, heavy, and sometimes slightly sour. Pottage, a thick vegetable stew that was a staple of medieval diet, containing onions, cabbage, beans, and perhaps some meat scraps if you were lucky. Salted or smoked meat rather than fresh roasts. Tougher, saltier, less pleasant, but preserved for long storage. Simple fish on fast days. Herring most commonly, as it was cheap and preserved well. Weak ale or beer rather than wine, though everyone drank some form of beer because water was unsafe. The portions were smaller, the variety less, the quality inferior in every way. Everyone ate with their hands and personal knives. Forks were virtually unknown in Northern Europe until the late Middle Ages, and were considered somewhat effeminate and unnecessary even then. A proper medieval person speared meat with their knife, cut pieces, and ate them with their fingers. Spoons existed and were used for soups and pottages, but most food was either solid enough to pick up or liquid enough to drink from the bowl. Plates were a luxury at lower tables. Many people used trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that served as edible plates. You placed your food on the trencher, which absorbed the juices and grease, and by the meal's end, the bread was soaked with flavor. The wealthy would then give their used trenchers to the poor as charity, both demonstrating generosity and getting rid of used tableware efficiently. The very poor considered gravy-soaked trenchers from noble tables a worthwhile meal. Table manners were important, and etiquette books from the period, written because these behaviors needed teaching, give us fascinating glimpses of typical behavior and how people were supposed to improve. Diners were instructed not to wipe their nose on the tablecloth, but to use a handkerchief or the back of their hand. Not to spit across the table, but to turn aside and spit on the floor. The rushes would absorb it. Not to dig through the common dish for the best pieces, but to take what came naturally to hand. Not to stuff their mouths so full they couldn't speak clearly, not to scratch themselves vigorously at the table, especially not under their clothes, not to throw bones on the floor immediately, but to pile them neatly to one side of the trencher, not to dip bread in the common dish, but to use their personal knife, not to drink with their mouth full, as this might cause them to spray their neighbors with partially chewed food. The fact that these behaviors needed prohibiting tells us they were common. Medieval table manners were, by our standards, rough. The great hall during a meal would have been noisy with conversation, laughing, arguments, belching, the sounds of people eating enthusiastically, and dogs barking and fighting over scraps. It was a chaotic, crowded social experience, not the refined dining we imagine. The dogs deserve special mention because castles always had numerous dogs. Hunting dogs, guard dogs, general pets. They roamed freely through the castle, and the great hall during meals was a favorite location. They waited beneath tables for dropped food or bones tossed by diners. They fought over scraps. They begged from diners. They occasionally jumped up to snatch food from tables. Their behavior ranged from well-trained to semi-feral, depending on the household standards and the individual animal. The constant presence of dogs added to the noise, the smell, and the general chaos of castle dining. After meals, the hall remained the center of activity. The tables might be pushed back or removed entirely to clear space. Evening entertainment might include professional musicians, traveling minstrels, acrobats, jugglers, storytellers, or just socializing and conversation among household members. This was the medieval equivalent of television, the main source of entertainment and social interaction. For people who worked hard and had limited recreation options, the evening hours in the great hall were important. But even entertainment was less comfortable than we imagine. The hall remained cold despite the fire. You sat on hard benches or stood for hours. The dim lighting made it difficult to see performers clearly if they were far away. The poor acoustics of the stone room meant that music echoed strangely and conversation required speaking loudly. If you wanted to hear the minstrel's song or the storyteller's tale, you needed to be close, which meant competing with many others for good spots near the fire and the performers. Musicians were valued, but their instruments required tuning and maintenance that was challenging in castle conditions. Stringed instruments like lutes went out of tune constantly as humidity and temperature changed. Drums split in dry conditions or became slack in damp ones. Wind instruments warped. Singers struggled with the cold air that affected their voices. A castle concert was not a polished performance, but a best-effort attempt under difficult conditions. The background noise was also constant. Dogs barking, servants moving about on their duties, guards calling from the walls, wind whistling through gaps, babies crying, people coughing. Nearly everyone had persistent coughs from the smoky environments and damp conditions. Someone always needed to relieve themselves and walked out. Someone else arrived late. Conversations continued in corners. Complete quiet was rare and often considered eerie rather than peaceful. Let's venture into other parts of the castle complex. The kitchen was a hot, smoky, dangerous place, dominated by massive fireplaces where meat roasted on spits turned by spit boys, young servants, or even dogs on treadwheels, who spent hours in the intense heat. Pots hung on hooks and chains over fires, cauldrons simmered, ovens baked bread. The floor was stone but slippery with grease, food scraps, and spilled liquids. The ceiling was blackened with smoke. The air was thick and difficult to breathe. Kitchen work was exhausting even in winter. The heat was intense near the fires, making kitchen servants sweat constantly even as other castle residents froze. In summer, the kitchen was hellish. Temperatures could easily exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Cooks and their assistants worked in minimal clothing, constantly drinking water or weak ale to stay hydrated, and still they suffered heat exhaustion. Burns were constant, from flames, hot metal, boiling water, and grease splatters. Kitchen servants bore scars from years of minor injuries. The head cook held significant power and responsibility. They managed food supplies, directed other kitchen staff, created menus, ensured dishes were properly prepared, and maintained the fires that had to burn continuously. A good cook was valued and well paid by medieval standards. A poor cook could poison the household through bad ingredients or preparation, so trust was essential. The cook tasted everything to ensure quality and safety, which meant they knew exactly how much better the Lord's food was than what servants received. The buttery and pantry, separate rooms for drinks and bread, respectively, were usually located off the Great Hall for convenient access during meals. These were supervised by specific servants whose entire job was managing these supplies. The butler controlled access to the barrels of beer and wine that kept the household hydrated, since water was often unsafe. The pantler managed bread storage and distribution. Both rooms needed to be cool but not damp, secure but accessible, requirements that castle architecture met imperfectly at best. The buttery held barrels stacked on their sides, tapped for serving. Wine and beer didn't age well under medieval conditions, so they needed regular checking. A barrel that had gone bad, turning to vinegar or developing off flavors, represented significant financial loss. The butler learned to recognize signs of spoilage and would blend wines or beers to stretch supplies or mask minor off flavors. The air in the buttery was yeasty and slightly alcoholic from the constant presence of fermenting and fermented beverages. Storage was a constant challenge in castles. Food preservation without refrigeration meant that castles needed extensive storage for salted meats, dried fish, grains, dried fruits, barrels of beer and wine, wheels of cheese, and preserved vegetables. Some castles had undercrofts, vaulted chambers under the keep, that stayed cool year-round and served as storage. These underground rooms were dark, damp, and often home to rats and insects, but they were the best option for long-term storage. Grain storage required particular care. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats had to be kept dry, or they would mold. They had to be protected from rats and mice that could devastate stores, and they had to be checked regularly for insect infestations, weevils that bored through kernels and multiplied rapidly. Bad grain storage could mean hunger or even starvation if supplies ran out before the next harvest. The person responsible for grain stores had serious responsibilities. Salted meat and fish hung in storage rooms, the salt crusts gradually drawing moisture from the air and growing damp. Before cooking, these preserved items needed soaking in multiple changes of water to remove enough salt to make them edible. Even after thorough soaking, preserved fish remained intensely salty and required vigorous seasoning with herbs, spices, and sauces to make them palatable. But in winter and early spring, when fresh meat was scarce, they were the primary protein available. Cheese wheels, some weighing 50 pounds or more, sat on shelves in cool storage. They developed hard rinds that protected the interior, but also harbored mold. Cutting into a wheel often revealed varying quality. The outside might be dried and sharp, while the center was still relatively fresh. Cheese that had gone truly bad developed spectacular smells and colors, but medieval people wasted little. They would cut away the worst parts and use the rest, perhaps cooking it into dishes where the off flavors would be masked. The chapel was another essential castle space, usually located in a prominent position because medieval people were devout or at least publicly pious. The castle chapel might be a simple room with an altar in smaller castles, or an elaborate two-story structure with a gallery for the Lord's family in larger ones. Either way, it was expected that everyone from lord to lowest servant would attend daily mass, at least in theory. But chapel attendance in cold weather was its own trial. The chapel was usually unheated, except for candles on the altar and perhaps a few that wealthier attendees brought for their own use. The stone construction, high ceilings, and minimal light made it the coldest place in an already cold castle. Winter masses meant standing or kneeling on icy stone floors, your breath visible in the air, hands too numb to make proper gestures or turn pages of prayer books, while trying to pay attention to Latin liturgy that most people didn't understand anyway. The priest intoned prayers in Latin that went on for what felt like hours in the bitter cold. Your knees ached from stone, your back hurt from standing, your feet went numb. Children shifted restlessly and were hushed by parents. People coughed. Someone always fainted from standing too long in the cold without food. But attendance was socially mandatory. Absence was noticed and judged. Religious devotion and social conformity were inseparable, and suffering through cold morning masses was part of demonstrating both. The chapel's decoration varied by wealth. Wealthy castles might have wall paintings, carved wooden altarpieces, silver vessels for communion, silk altar cloths, and stained glass windows that created beautiful light effects, though they also let in cold drafts. Poorer chapels made do with whitewashed walls, simple wooden furniture, brass or pewter vessels, and plain glass or shuttered windows, but all had crosses, images of saints, and the physical trappings of Catholic worship that dominated medieval life. The castle's defenses, which were its whole reason for existing, also shaped daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. The high walls that protected residents also trapped them during sieges, which could last months. During a siege, everyone inside, nobles, soldiers, servants, faced dwindling food supplies, disease from crowded conditions, and the psychological stress of being surrounded by enemies. The very walls that provided security also created the conditions for potential disaster. The narrow windows that prevented attackers from entering also prevented light and air from entering during peaceful times. The murder holes, openings in upper floors through which defenders could drop stones or boiling liquids on attackers, created drafts and let in rain when not in use. The arrow slits that allowed archers to shoot at enemies created focused jets of cold air. Every defensive feature that made the castle militarily strong made it less comfortable to live in. The battlements where guards walked their rounds were completely exposed to weather. Guards faced wind, rain, snow, and sun, while walking back and forth on narrow walkways behind waist-high stone walls. These positions were dangerous in storms when wind could blow a person off balance. They were brutal in winter when guards needed to maintain alertness despite numbing cold. And they were necessary every hour of every day and night because a castle always had to maintain vigilance. Many castles were surrounded by moats, water-filled ditches that prevented enemies from approaching walls with siege equipment. But moats were essentially open sewers that received waste from the guardrobes, drainage from the bailey, animal waste, and anything else that needed to. They were perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes and summer, filling the castle with swarms of insects that bit incessantly. The smell from a stagnant moat in hot weather was memorable, and there was no escaping it because the windows, though small, still admitted air. In winter, moats sometimes froze, which created a layer of ice that trapped organic matter and created interesting smells when temperatures warmed. The ice was usually too thin to walk on safely, but thick enough to trap dying fish and concentrate odors. Some castles had fish in their moats, carp, pike, or other species that could tolerate the conditions, which provided food but also meant dead fish occasionally floated to the surface and decomposed, contributing to the general aromatic experience. The well was one of the castle's most vital features. A castle under siege needed an internal water supply, so wells were often dug deep, sometimes hundreds of feet, through solid rock to reach groundwater that wouldn't run dry. Drawing water from these depths was exhausting work performed multiple times daily by servants on bucket brigades or using windlass systems that required cranking heavy handles. Castle residents were constantly hauling water for drinking, cooking, washing, and the occasional bath. The well never froze, even in the worst winter, but in deep winter, the water was searingly cold, painful to touch, and shocking to drink. The well also required maintenance. Stones fell from the lining and had to be removed, or they would clog the system. The ropes used to lower buckets frayed and broke. The buckets themselves wore out and needed replacement. Someone had to periodically descend into the well, a terrifying job in a narrow stone shaft hundreds of feet deep with water at the bottom, to inspect and repair the lining. Wells were dangerous, essential, and constant sources of work. Let's talk about the people who made castle life function. The servants. A large castle employed dozens or even hundreds of servants, each with specific roles that created a complex hierarchy. At the top were officers, the chamberlain who managed household operations, the marshal who oversaw stables and travel arrangements, the butler who controlled drinks, the pantler who managed bread, and the steward who supervised everything and reported directly to the Lord. Below them were skilled servants, cooks, bakers, brewers, laundresses, tailors, scribes, and various craftspeople whose skills were essential to castle operations. Then came general servants, chambermaids who cleaned chambers, hall boys who cleaned the great hall, scullery maids who washed dishes and pots, stable hands who cared for horses, and general laborers who carried, lifted, hauled, and did whatever needed doing. At the bottom were the truly unfortunate, grooms of the stool who emptied chamber pots, muckrakers who cleaned animal waste, and other servants who handled the dirtiest, smelliest, most unpleasant tasks that nobody wanted, but everyone needed done. These positions were filled by the poorest, most desperate workers who had no other option. The pay was minimal, but the work provided food and shelter, which was more than they'd have otherwise. These servants lived in the worst parts of the castle. Upper servants might have small private chambers, tiny rooms barely large enough for a narrow bed and a chest. Most servants slept in crowded communal spaces, drafty attics where wind whistled through gaps in the roof, damp basement chambers where moisture ran down walls, or on the floor of the great hall wherever they could find space. Privacy was non-existent. Personal possessions were minimal because there was nowhere to store them and always a risk of theft. They ate the plainest food, dark bread, thin pottage, occasional scraps of meat, and weak beer. Their meals were eaten quickly, often standing in whatever time they could spare from work. A servant's workday began before dawn. They needed to rekindle fires, draw water, and prepare for the households, and ended whenever all tasks were complete, often long after dark. Days off were rare, perhaps a few religious feast days per year. Illness or injury meant you couldn't work, which meant you might be dismissed with no support. But despite the hardships, positions in noble households were actually desirable. Servants had shelter, regular food, and a form of security that landless peasants lacked. They might learn skills that could lead to better positions. They had protection within the castle's walls, and they belonged to a community, however hierarchical and harsh. For many people, serving in a castle was their best available option. Children in castles lived differently depending on their status. Noble children were often sent to other households as pages and ladies-in-waiting, learning skills and manners while forming social connections that would benefit them throughout life. Boys as young as 7 might be sent away from home to begin training for knighthood. They started as pages, serving at table and learning basic courtly behavior. At around 14, they became squires, learning weapons and horsemanship while serving a specific knight. If successful, they might be knighted in their late teens or early 20s. This system meant that noble children grew up away from their parents, raised by strangers in unfamiliar households. It was considered essential for their education and social development, but it must have been traumatic for young children sent away from everything familiar. Homesickness, harsh treatment from training masters, and the competitive environment of castle life created pressures that some children couldn't handle. But complaining wasn't acceptable. You endured, learned, and hoped to survive with your honor and prospects intact. Girls around age 12 might be sent to learn household management and needlework, while their families negotiated marriage alliances. They served as ladies-in-waiting to the household's lady, learning the skills they'd need to manage their own household someday. This included supervising servants, managing accounts, organizing work, negotiating with merchants, and maintaining the social relationships that held medieval society together. These were genuine skills requiring intelligence and education, but they were learned through service to other nobles rather than formal schooling. But servant children started working young, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, performing simple tasks like carrying messages, fetching items, or helping with basic cleaning. As they grew, their responsibilities increased. They learned by doing, watching older servants, and imitating their work. Childhood as a protected period didn't exist for working-class people. You contributed or you were a burden, and families couldn't afford burdens. The constable or castellan, the person who actually managed the castle when the lord was absent, which was often, faced constant challenges. Maintaining a castle required ongoing work and vigilance. Stone walls needed repointing where mortar crumbled from age, weather, or freeze-thaw cycles. Roofs needed repairs after storms. Wooden floors needed replacing as they rotted from moisture or broke from use. Windows needed reglazing when glass cracked or lead strips corroded. Whitewash needed reapplying to interior walls, both for appearance and because it helped reflect what little light there was. These repairs required skilled craftsmen who expected payment, raw materials that had to be purchased or sourced, and money that was always in short supply. Many castles existed in partial disrepair, with leaking roofs, crumbling sections of wall, broken equipment, and deferred maintenance that created problems. The constable constantly had to prioritize, fix the roof or repoint the wall, repair the well or replace the rotted floor. Every decision involved weighing necessity against available resources. Security was a constant concern, even during peacetime. Guards walked the walls day and night in all weather, watching for threats both external and internal. Theft was common in crowded castle conditions where valuable items were difficult to secure. Fire was an ever-present danger. Accidental deaths from falls, fights, or mishaps happened regularly. The constable had to investigate incidents, maintain order, ensure guards stayed alert, and keep the castle functioning despite the human problems that arose from keeping many people in close quarters. Gates were locked at sunset and not reopened until dawn. This meant anyone outside after curfew stayed outside all night, whatever the weather or circumstance. Similarly, anyone inside stayed inside. This created both security and constraint. You were protected, but also trapped. Movement was controlled and monitored. Strangers were viewed with suspicion and interrogated. This created a sense of being imprisoned as much as protected. The isolation of many castles added another dimension to life within them. Built on defensible positions, hilltops, cliff edges, rocky outcrops, islands, castles were often remote from towns and villages. This strategic location meant that entertainment, news, and variety in daily life were limited. The same people interacted daily in the same spaces for years. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Everyone had long histories of conflicts and alliances. Privacy was impossible, and social mistakes were remembered forever. This isolation also affected supplies. Everything needed in the castle had to be brought in, often over difficult terrain. Food, fuel, building materials, cloth, tools, all required transport from elsewhere. In winter, when roads were impassable with mud or snow, the castle might be cut off for weeks or months. This required maintaining large stores of supplies, but even careful planning couldn't prevent shortages. When supplies ran low, everyone suffered together, creating tensions between those who received larger shares and those who went without. Seasonal changes affected castle life dramatically. Summer brought relief from intense cold, but introduced new problems. Heat trapped in stone buildings created stifling conditions in upper chambers. Insects bred prolifically, flies from the stables and moat, mosquitoes from any standing water, fleas and bedbugs in every bed and piece of cloth. Food spoiled faster, requiring greater vigilance and more frequent disposal of waste. The smell from moat intensified. Work outdoors, necessary for cultivation, repairs, and various castle operations, became exhausting in heat. Winter brought the intense cold we've discussed, but also short days that limited productive work hours. The psychological impact of dark, cold months trapped indoors was significant. Seasonal depression, though not recognized as such, must have affected many people. The isolation increased when snow blocked roads. Supplies dwindled as stored food was consumed. Illness spread in crowded indoor conditions. Winter was a season to survive rather than enjoy. Spring brought mud everywhere as snow melted and rain fell. The Bailey became nearly impassable. Travel was difficult. But spring also brought relief from winter's worst cold, longer days and the promise of fresh food eventually. Planting began in castle gardens and in fields belonging to the castle's lands. Energy increased with daylight and warmer weather. Autumn brought the crucial harvest season when food for winter had to be gathered, preserved, and stored. This was an all-hands effort involving everyone who could work. Fields were harvested, grain was threshed and stored, animals were slaughtered, and the meat salted or smoked. Vegetables were preserved, fruits were dried. Success or failure during autumn harvest season determined whether the castle ate well or poorly through winter. Poor harvests created genuine hardship and sometimes starvation. The castle calendar revolved around religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, which provided breaks from routine and excuses for feasting. Christmas was particularly important, lasting 12 days and involving special foods, entertainment, gift-giving, and celebration that broke winter's monotony. Easter brought feasting after Lent's abstinence. Saints' Days provided scattered celebrations. But these celebrations also meant extra work for servants preparing food, cleaning spaces, and serving guests. The great feasts that nobles enjoyed, roasted meats, special breads, imported wines, elaborate dishes, represented exhausting labor for the cooks, servers, and cleaners who made them possible. A feast day for nobles was often the hardest workday of the year for servants. They prepared and served elaborate meals, cleaned up afterwards, and dealt with drunk nobles and guests while maintaining professional demeanor. Guest accommodations presented special challenges. Visiting nobles expected hospitality, elaborate meals, comfortable quarters, entertainment. But castles had limited space and resources. Important guests might be given the lord's own chamber, forcing the lord and lady to sleep elsewhere. Less important visitors slept in the great hall with servants or in hastily arranged quarters wherever space could be found. A large retinue accompanying a visiting lord might overwhelm the castle's capacity, straining supplies of food, wine, firewood, and bedding. The social dynamics of hosting created pressure. A lord needed to demonstrate wealth and hospitality to maintain status, but excessive generosity could deplete resources. A host who fed guests well while the household went hungry created resentment, but guests who felt poorly treated could damage the lord's reputation. Managing these competing demands required political skill and careful resource management. The sounds of castle life created a constant background that became normal to residents, but that visitors found notable. Stone walls echoed every footstep, conversation, barking dog, and clanging pot. Sounds carried through the stone passages in strange ways. A conversation in one room might be clearly audible several rooms away through some acoustic quirk, while a shout directly outside a door might be muffled. The wind created an ever-present whistle and howl through arrow slits and around towers. The creaking of timbers, the settling of stone, the dripping of water, all contributed to the castle's voice. Guards called out watches through the night. 1 o'clock and all's well, or similar announcements that let everyone know guards were alert and no threats approached. These calls echoed through corridors and chambers, waking light sleepers regularly. Horses neighed in stables. Chickens clucked in the bailey. The blacksmith's hammer rang on the anvil during the working. Dogs barked at everything. Babies cried. People coughed. Nearly everyone had persistent coughs from smoke and damp. Someone was always making noise. Smells in a castle were complex and pervasive. Wood smoke from fires was constant, varying in intensity but never absent. Cooking food provided both appetizing smells, roasting meat, baking bread, and less pleasant ones, boiling offal, burning fat. Unwashed bodies and clothes created a background smell of human existence. Animal waste from the bailey and moat contributed earthy, organic odors. Rotting rushes on floors added their own distinctive aroma. Mustiness from damp stone pervaded everything. Occasional perfumes, incense, and aromatic herbs provided pleasant counterpoints, but couldn't eliminate the base notes. These odors blended into a general castle smell that residents became accustomed to, the olfactory equivalent of background noise that you stopped noticing. But visitors were immediately struck by it, and letters and accounts from travelers often mentioned how different castles smelled. Some were better maintained, cleaner, fresher. Others were notorious for unpleasant odors that marked poor management or simply unfortunate circumstances. The lack of light after sunset meant that castle life effectively ended at dusk for most residents. Candles, oil lamps, and torches were expensive, so artificial light was used sparingly. The lord's family and important guests might have candles in their chambers for a few hours after dark. The great hall might be lit for evening entertainment, but most servants worked by daylight and slept after dark, simply because working in darkness was inefficient and dangerous. Winter, with its long nights, meant more time spent sleeping or sitting idle in darkness, conserving resources. A winter day might give only 8 hours of usable daylight, and bad weather could make even those hours dim. People slept longer in winter, partly because there was simply less to do in the dark. The isolation and darkness of winter evenings could be oppressive, contributing to seasonal depression and cabin fever in a castle that already felt confining. Medical care in castles was better than in villages, but still primitive by modern standards. Larger castles might have a resident physician trained at a university, but medical knowledge was limited and often counterproductive. Treatments included bloodletting, deliberately opening veins to remove bad blood, which weakened patients. Herbal remedies had some genuine effects, but were hit or miss. Prayer and relics were considered medical treatments as valid as anything a physician might offer. Serious injuries often proved fatal. A broken leg might heal, but often left the person with a permanent limp. Infections regularly killed people from minor wounds because antibiotics didn't exist. Diseases spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, dysentery, and various fevers killed rich and poor alike. Life expectancy was short. Surviving to 40 made you an elder, and child mortality was heartbreaking. Many families lost half or more of their children before age 5. The cold, damp conditions of castle life promoted respiratory ailments. Everyone had coughs. Many developed chronic bronchitis or other lung problems from breathing smoke constantly. rheumatism-afflicted joints exposed to cold and damp. Chilblains were universal. Skin conditions from poor hygiene and lice infestations affected everyone. Being healthy in a castle required robust constitution and good luck. Women in castles, even noble women, had constrained lives despite their relative privilege. The lady of the castle managed the household, supervising servants, planning meals, overseeing spinning and weaving, managing supplies, maintaining accounts, ensuring the castle functioned smoothly. This was demanding work, requiring intelligence, organizational skills, and constant attention. When the lord was absent, which was often as lords traveled for military, political, or economic reasons, the lady effectively ran the entire castle operation. But women's work was also confining. They rarely traveled without male relatives for protection. Their main value was as bearers of heirs and formers of political alliances through marriage. A woman's marriage was arranged for political and economic benefit, not personal preference. She might meet her husband for the first time on their wedding day. She was expected to produce sons, manage the household, maintain proper behavior, and support her husband's interests. Personal desires or ambitions were largely irrelevant. Childbirth was extremely dangerous. Many women died in childbirth or from complications after. Those who survived might bear 10 or more children, of whom half might die in infancy. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies, the emotional toll of losing children, and the danger of each birth created constant anxiety. Women who survived multiple childbirths and lived to old age were considered remarkably fortunate. The romantic idea of castle life, knights, fair ladies, chivalry, courtly love, existed mainly in literature and imagination. Real castle life was uncomfortable, constrained, and often boring. The great majority of time was spent on routine tasks, managing supplies, settling disputes, overseeing work, maintaining equipment, organizing meals, handling accounts, and simply surviving the cold, damp, and darkness that defined castle living. Knights were professional soldiers who trained constantly for war, but fought rarely. Much of their time was spent on maintenance, cleaning weapons and armor, caring for horses, practicing with weapons, supervising soldiers. When not actively at war, which was most of the time, knights filled administrative roles, managed lands, or simply waited. The excitement of tournaments and battles was rare. The daily reality was routine military preparation and estate management. Yet castles represented the pinnacle of medieval life. Those living in them were privileged compared to peasants in villages or serfs bound to the land. Castle residents had protection from attack, reliable food supplies most of the time, access to skilled craftspeople and medical care, such as it was, and social status. The discomforts of castle life were accepted as normal, and the alternative, life outside the protective walls, was often worse. The castle's defensive function meant it was also a prison of sorts. During conflicts, residents might be trapped inside for months during sieges, even during peace. The isolation, the controlled gates, the surveillance created an environment where freedom was limited. You couldn't simply leave. You needed permission, resources, and often armed escort. The safety provided by walls came at the cost of mobility and freedom. As dawn breaks over our castle, illuminating the gray stone walls with weak morning light filtering through narrow windows, the household stirs once again. Servants begin hauling water from the deep well, their muscles protesting the familiar strain. Kitchen workers rekindle fires that have burned low overnight, blowing on embers and feeding kindling until flames grow. The smell of wood smoke drifts through corridors. The castle comes to life for another day. The lord and lady rise in their cold chamber, assisted by personal servants who help them dress in layers against the chill that never really leaves. Guards change shifts on the walls, relieved to end their night watch in the wind and cold. The constable makes his morning rounds, checking on security, noting repairs needed, assessing what the new day demands. Life in the castle continues as it has for generations, a daily struggle for comfort and security within impressive stone walls that protect but also confine. The experience of castle living teaches us that comfort is relative and that our ancestors' resilience in the face of conditions we'd find intolerable is remarkable. They built impressive structures that still stand centuries later. They conducted complex social and political systems. They created art, literature, and culture. They shaped history. And they did all of this while cold, uncomfortable, and living in conditions that would horrify modern building inspectors and public health officials. Their acceptance of hardship as normal challenges our own complaints about minor discomforts. They endured because they had no alternative and because everyone around them endured the same conditions. The shared experience of castle life, however difficult, created bonds and community that helped people survive and even find moments of joy in feast days, companionship, and small comforts. And so ends our tour of medieval castle life. If you enjoyed this journey into the less glamorous side of medieval nobility, subscribe for more deep dives into the reality of historical eras. Let me know in the comments which aspect of castle life surprised you most, or which other historical topic you'd like to explore next. Rest well, time traveler. And tonight, as you lie in your warm, comfortable bed, in your properly heated home with modern plumbing and electric lights at your fingertips, perhaps you'll appreciate these luxuries a bit more, knowing what your medieval ancestors endured. Sweet dreams.